April 29, 1943. 4,200 meters above the Kuban River, southern Russia. 0640 hours. The temperature at altitude sits 11 degrees below freezing, and a morning haze over the Sea of Azov has not yet burned off. Wilhelm Batz banks his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 into the sun, watching the shapes climbing toward him from the Soviet side of the front. He has flown against these silhouettes before, squat, barrel-bodied, tricycle-geared things the Americans built and could not use, that the British flew briefly and discarded, that Stalin's quartermasters accepted the way a man accepts a debt he cannot refuse. Batz has heard what his comrades call them: Klotskopf, blockheads, fat, slow, unbalanced aircraft with an engine bolted in behind the pilot's spine instead of in front of his face, an arrangement no sane engineer in Germany would have signed off on. What Batz cannot see, banking through that thin morning light, is the detail hidden behind the aircraft's blunt nose cone, a single black aperture, no wider than a man's fist, sitting dead center in the spinner of the propeller. It is not a gun camera. It is not a landing light. It is the muzzle of a 37mm cannon, firing through the hollow crankshaft of an engine mounted 4 feet behind the pilot's shoulder blades, an arrangement so strange that American test pilots at Wright Field had distrusted it, and so lethal in the hands of the men now flying it that within 11 months it would help end Batz's finest season of killing. He does not know that yet. This morning, he only sees blockheads climbing into his sun, and he pushes his throttle forward the way a hunter pushes forward when the deer has not yet noticed him. Chapter 1. A Weapon Nobody Wanted. The Bell P-39 Airacobra began its life not as a rejection, but as an obsession. The obsession of a design team in Buffalo, New York in 1937, convinced that the future of the fighter aircraft belonged not to the machine gun, but to the cannon, and not to the nose, but to the mid-fuselage. They placed the Allison V-1710 engine behind the cockpit, ran a 19-foot extension shaft beneath the pilot's seat to the propeller, and opened a clear channel down the center of the aircraft's spine for a weapon no other fighter of its generation carried: a 37mm cannon, firing straight through the propeller hub, capable of putting a single shell through the wing root of a bomber and leaving nothing behind to repair. It was on paper a revolution. In practice, it was a machine built around a compromise nobody in Buffalo had the authority to fix. The Army Air Corps, chasing speed and altitude performance above all else, stripped the turbo-supercharger from the production design to save weight and simplify manufacturing. A single decision, made in a procurement office far from any runway, that would leave the Airacobra breathless above 15,000 feet for the rest of its operational life. Pilots who took her above that ceiling found an aircraft that grew sluggish, heavy, and increasingly unwilling to answer the stick, precisely the altitude at which the Luftwaffe and the Japanese Zero preferred to fight. The British took delivery first, flew the type briefly over the English Channel in 1941, and rejected it within months. Unsuitable for high-altitude interception, they said, and privately, several RAF pilots called it a coffin with a cannon bolted to the front. The Americans, watching their own test squadron struggle with an aircraft that could snap into an unrecoverable spin if handled carelessly at low speed, quietly began routing their newest Airacobras somewhere else entirely. Not to a scrapyard, but on a ships bound for a port on the Persian Gulf, destined for an ally most of the men in Buffalo would never meet. That ally was the Soviet Union, and what the American engineers in Buffalo could not have known as they watched their unwanted design sail east under the terms of Lend-Lease was that they were not sending away a failure. They were sending away, unknowingly, the fighter that would help determine who controlled the oil fields of the Caucasus, and with them, the outcome of the entire Eastern Front. Chapter 2. An Engine Behind the Spine. The Airacobra reached the Soviet Union by way of Iran, trucked and flown north through Persian mountain passes that had never before carried American war machines, arriving at Red Air Force depots where mechanics who had never seen a tricycle landing gear before had to learn its geometry from translated manuals. What they found, when they opened the engine compartment behind the cockpit, unsettled even experienced ground crews. The Allison engine sat where no engine had ever sat in a Soviet-built fighter, directly beneath and behind the pilot's seat, its drive shaft running forward under the man's boots to a reduction gearbox, and the propeller hub 12 feet ahead. A pilot flying the Airacobra sat not behind his engine, as in every fighter he had trained on, but astride the beating iron heart of the machine itself, close enough to feel its vibration through the seat pan on every mission. This arrangement carried a hidden cost that no amount of Soviet engineering ingenuity could fully erase. The center of gravity sat further aft than in almost any other fighter of the war, and in the hands of an inexperienced pilot who mishandled the controls at low airspeed, the Airacobra could enter a flat spin from which recovery was nearly impossible. The aircraft simply rotating, flat and helpless, toward the ground while the pilot fought controls that no longer answered him. Soviet training units recorded the losses quietly, the way any air force records the price of learning a new machine, and the men who survived those early spins carry the knowledge forward into every cockpit briefing that followed. Respect this aircraft's tail, or it will kill you before the enemy has the chance. And yet the same rear-mounted engine that made the Airacobra dangerous in inexperienced hands made it something else entirely in skilled ones. A fighter whose nose, freed from the bulk of a piston engine, could be built lean and narrow around that 37mm cannon, giving Soviet pilots a forward view over the gun sight that German and American pilots alike would later admit they envied, and a weapon capable of ending a bomber or a locomotive with a single well-placed round. The very feature the West had called impractical, Soviet mechanics on airfields near Krasnodar began quietly calling something else. A gun platform built by men who understood killing power better than they understood salesmanship. It was into one of those airfields, in the early months of 1943, that a squadron commander named Alexander Pokryshkin arrived to take command of a unit re-equipping with the American aircraft nobody back in Buffalo had wanted to keep. Chapter 3. The Commander Who Read the Machine. Pokryshkin had already survived 2 years of war, flying Soviet-built fighters that were outclassed by the Messerschmitt in nearly every technical category that mattered: climb rate, diving speed, cannon range. He had watched pilots under his command die, running the same tired tactics Soviet doctrine demanded of them. Tight formations, close-range dogfighting, turning battles that played directly into German strengths. He arrived at the airfield expecting another compromise, another American cast-off dressed up as salvation. And what he found instead was an aircraft whose flaws he understood immediately, because they were the same flaws every fighter in his command had already taught him to fear: weak above 5,000 meters, dangerous in a stall, unforgiving of a careless hand on the rudder. What set Pokryshkin apart from the pilots who had rejected this aircraft twice before was not admiration. It was arithmetic. He calculated, on paper and then in the air, exactly where the Airacobra's weaknesses stopped matching: below 5,000 meters, where the German turbo-supercharged engines lost their decisive advantage, and where the Airacobra's flat, stable gun platform and heavy forward armament could outshoot anything the Luftwaffe brought against it. He began to build, from that single calculation, a set of tactics that Soviet doctrine had never sanctioned and German pilots had never encountered. The vertical maneuver Pokryshkin's men would come to call the Kuban Shelf, a staggered, layered formation flown at low altitude, trading the turning fight the Messerschmitt wanted for a fast, diving, cannon-first engagement the Airacobra was built to win. His desire was not abstract patriotism. It was specific and small enough to fit inside a single cockpit, to bring the pilots flying beneath him back to this airfield alive, in an aircraft two nations had already decided was not worth the risk. Every tactic he refined against that rejected machine's known limits was, in practice, an argument against every letter he did not want to write to a mother in Novosibirsk or a wife in Rostov. The stakes were never the abstraction of the Eastern Front. They were the seat behind him, and the seat behind that one, and the 20 seats behind those, each one holding a young man who trusted an aircraft the manufacturer's own countrymen had already given up on. He did not yet know the name of the German pilot, whose formation his squadron would meet within weeks, over a river delta that would come to bear the name of the campaign itself. Wilhelm Batz did not yet know Pokryshkin's name either. Both men, on opposite ends of the same stretch of sky, were flying toward each other with the same quiet hope pinned to entirely different aircraft. That this machine, whatever its flaws, would be the one that carried them home. Chapter 4. The Kuban Bridgehead. By April 1943, the Kuban Peninsula had become one of the most concentrated air battles of the entire war, a narrow strip of southern Russia where the German army, pushed back from Stalingrad, dug in to hold a bridgehead protecting its retreat and the approaches to the Caucasus oil fields beyond. Both air forces poured their most capable units into a battle space barely 100 kilometers wide, and for weeks the skies over the Kuban River carried more aircraft per square kilometer than almost any front of the war, German and Soviet formations meeting in engagements that sometimes ran 50 aircraft to a side. It was here that the Airacobra's rejected design met its intended purpose for the first time. Flying below the altitude, where its lack of a supercharger crippled it, and organized by Pokryshkin's staggered formations rather than the close, rigid Soviet doctrine of years prior. The aircraft began to inflict losses on German fighter units that Luftwaffe intelligence had not anticipated from an airframe they had already dismissed as second-rate salvage. Soviet ground observers began reporting something unfamiliar in the wreckage patterns below. German fighters brought down not by machine gun fire chipping away an airframe, but by single catastrophic hits, wings separating cleanly from fuselages, a signature the Luftwaffe's own maintenance officers recognized immediately as cannon fire, and heavy cannon fire at that. Wilhelm Batz, flying with Jagerschwader 52 over that same river delta, recorded his first written doubt about the aircraft he had once dismissed with a single word. In a report filed after a mid-April engagement, Batz noted that the Soviet fighters he had expected to outturn and outdive with contemptuous ease were instead diving through his formation from above, firing once, and climbing away before his own wingmen could react, a tactic that did not match anything German pilots had briefed against. He called it, in that same report, an unexpected discipline he had not thought the aircraft or its pilots capable of. It was the first crack in an assessment that had begun, only weeks earlier, as pure contempt. But something strange was happening in those skies that neither Air Force had yet fully understood, and it would take another month of brutal, grinding engagements over the Kuban before either side could say with certainty which machine and which pilot actually controlled the corridor beneath them. Chapter 5. The Weapon in the Nose. The 37mm cannon at the heart of the Airacobra's design carried a rate of fire that, by the standards of contemporary fighter armament, was almost deliberately slow. A mechanically fed weapon capable of no more than 2 rounds per second, compared to the far higher cyclic rates of the machine guns clustered around it in the wings and nose. American engineers had built the weapon this way on purpose, trading speed of fire for the raw destructive power of each individual shell, betting that a single accurate hit mattered more than a hail of lighter rounds. It was a bet the American test pilots at Wright Field had never fully trusted, in a bet that Soviet pilots over the Kuban, flying against German aircraft built from riveted aluminum and thin armor plate, found themselves winning with startling consistency. A single 37mm shell, striking a Messerschmitt's wing root or engine mount, did not simply damage the aircraft. It severed structural members outright, the kind of catastrophic failure that left German ground crews back at their own airfields staring at gun camera footage and radio reports describing aircraft that had come apart in midair rather than limping home smoking. For the pilots flying beneath that cannon, the weapon's slow rate of fire demanded a discipline that Pokryshkin drilled into every man under his command. Close the distance, hold the aim, fire once, and trust the shell rather than spraying rounds and hoping. It was not a weapon built for a nervous pilot. It was a weapon built for a patient one, and patience in the brutal arithmetic of the Kuban air battles translated directly into a pilot's survival. One of those patient pilots was a young lieutenant named Grigory Rechkalov, flying alongside Pokryshkin's squadron, a man whose personal ambition had nothing to do with grand strategy and everything to do with a promise made to his father before the war, that he would return to their village outside Sverdlovsk with proof he had done more than survive, that he had mattered. Rechkalov's early combat record had been unremarkable, a handful of inconclusive engagements that left him convinced he lacked whatever instinct separated the aces from the men who simply came home. It was Pokryshkin's tactics and the Airacobra's cannon that gave Rechkalov the tool his instincts had been missing, the discipline to wait for the shot rather than force it. What happened next defied every tactical assumption the Germans had built their Kuban air defense around, and it began not with Pokryshkin's own guns, but with the quiet, patient lieutenant flying just off his wing. Chapter 6. Rechkalov's Wait. On May 3rd, 1943, Rechkalov's flight intercepted a formation of German bombers escorted by Messerschmitts near the town of Krymskaya, and rather than diving immediately into the escort as Soviet doctrine had trained him to do for 2 years, he held his position, watching the German fighters commit to a turning engagement with the rest of his squadron below. He waited through nearly 90 seconds of combat, an eternity in a fighter cockpit, every second carrying the risk that his own aircraft would be spotted and bracketed by a German wingman he had not seen, before diving on a Messerschmitt that had briefly separated from his formation to pursue a Soviet fighter below. The shot Rechkalov fired that afternoon traveled less than 200 meters before it struck the German fighter's engine mount, and the aircraft did not spiral or trail smoke the way damaged fighters so often did in the reports Rechkalov had read as a young trainee. It simply broke apart, the nose section separating from the fuselage in a single violent motion, and Rechkalov would later describe watching pieces of the aircraft tumble past his own canopy close enough that he instinctively ducked, an instinct with no purpose against an armored windscreen, but one that told him everything he needed to know about how close he had allowed the engagement to become. He had waited. The waiting had worked. He flew back to the airfield near Krasnodar that evening with his fuel gauge nearly empty and, for the first time since the war began, the quiet conviction that he might actually be one of the pilots who mattered. German intelligence had failed to notice one catastrophic detail buried in the after-action reports accumulating from the Kuban front, that the aircraft inflicting these single-shot catastrophic losses on Luftwaffe fighters was not, as several early briefings had assumed, a newer or more sophisticated Soviet design entirely. It was the same blunt-nosed, tricycle-geared American reject that German pilots had spent the opening weeks of the campaign dismissing with contempt. Wilhelm Batz, reviewing combat reports from his own wing that spring, began referring to the aircraft by a different designation than the one his squadron had used in March. He no longer called it a Klotskov. He began, in his own written reports, calling it simply the Cobra, a name that carried none of the earlier contempt and all of the caution a hunter reserved for prey that has begun, unexpectedly, to hunt back. Chapter 7. The Cannon in the Smoke. By late May 1943, the air battle over the Kuban had settled into a grinding rhythm of daily engagements, sometimes 3 and 4 sorties per pilot per day, an operational tempo that exhausted airframes and men in equal measure. Ground crews at Pokryshkin's airfield worked through the night by lamplight to keep the Airacobras flying, patching bullet holes in aluminum skin, replacing propeller blades chipped by debris, and, most delicately of all, servicing the mechanical feed mechanism of the 37mm cannon buried in the nose, a weapon whose complexity made it as demanding to maintain as it was devastating to fire. It was during one of these engagements, on May 21st, that Pokryshkin's own squadron met Batz's formation in a running battle that stretched across nearly 40 kilometers of sky above the Kuban Delta, a fight that both sides would later describe in radio logs and after-action reports as one of the most sustained single engagements of the entire campaign. Pokryshkin himself, diving through the German formation in the staggered attack pattern he had spent months refining, fired his own cannon at a Messerschmitt closing on a wingman below him, the black muzzle at the center of his propeller hub flashing once in the gray afternoon light before the German fighter's wing folded backward under the shell's impact, and the aircraft spun, trailing smoke thick enough that Pokryshkin's own gun camera lost sight of it in the haze. He did not know, in that moment, whose aircraft he had struck. It was not until after the war, cross-referencing Luftwaffe loss records against his own combat log, that historians would identify the pilot in that Messerschmitt as one of Batz's own wingmen, a young Feldwebel whose name survives only in the unit's casualty roster, a single line among hundreds recording an aircraft lost near Krimskaya, with no confirmed cause beyond enemy action. That anonymous line in a German casualty ledger, and the letter it likely generated to a family somewhere in Bavaria, represents the same cost the war extracted from both sides in equal measure, a cost the Airacobra's cannon inflicted with brutal efficiency, and one that neither Pokryshkin nor Batz could afford to forget was paid, ultimately, by young men who wanted nothing more exotic than to see their families again. Perhaps the ultimate vindication for this design came when Batz's own combat reports, filed in the weeks following that engagement, began describing something his earlier dismissals had never anticipated needing to explain. Chapter 8. Batz's Reckoning. Wilhelm Batz was not a pilot inclined toward exaggeration. His combat record, meticulously maintained across hundreds of sorties on the Eastern Front, reflected a methodical, almost clinical approach to aerial combat, the kind of professional detachment that had made him one of the most effective fighter pilots in his wing. It is precisely this detachment that makes his written assessment of the Kuban campaign, filed in June 1943, carry the weight it does. He noted, in language stripped of the contempt his earlier reports had carried freely, that Soviet fighter tactics over the Kuban bridgehead had evolved into something his own formation struggled to counter. Coordinated, disciplined attacks flown by pilots who no longer matched the aggressive but poorly organized opponent's German pilots had grown accustomed to defeating earlier in the war. He identified, without naming the aircraft type directly in every instance, a pattern of losses among his own squadron's Messerschmitts that traced back consistently to a single weapon system, a heavy-caliber cannon capable of destroying a fighter aircraft with one accurate strike, fired by pilots employing altitude and surprise rather than turning combat. Batz's report represents, in the clinical language of Luftwaffe operational assessment, something close to fear. Not panic, not the terror of a pilot facing certain death, but the colder, more professional fear of a skilled predator realizing the terrain has shifted beneath him, that the prey he once hunted with contempt has learned to hunt in return. The numbers accumulating across the Kuban campaign by June 1943 tell the same story in colder arithmetic. Luftwaffe fighter losses over the Bridgehead climbed to a rate that German high command found difficult to sustain against an air force it had spent 2 years describing as inferior. Losses running into the hundreds of aircraft across the campaign's duration, each one representing not merely a machine, but a trained pilot whose replacement required months of instruction the Luftwaffe's dwindling training pipeline could no longer easily provide. Every down Messerschmitt over the Kuban meant one fewer experienced pilot available for the increasingly desperate air battles the Luftwaffe would face over the following 2 years, a slow bleeding of institutional skill that the German Air Force would never fully recover. For Pokryshkin's squadron, the arithmetic ran in the opposite direction, and it was here, in the final weeks of the Kuban campaign, that the aircraft two nations had already rejected proved beyond argument that it had found a one battle space, and the one commander capable of turning its flaws into a weapon. Chapter 9. The Sky Held. By the first week of July 1943, Soviet air superiority over the Kuban bridgehead had shifted decisively, the culmination of nearly 3 months of sustained combat in which Pokryshkin's tactics, and the aircraft he had refused to reject, transformed a sector of the Eastern Front that German planners had once treated as a secure flank into one of the costliest air battles the Luftwaffe had yet fought. Soviet fighter regiments operating the Airacobra across the Kuban campaign accounted for a disproportionate share of confirmed German aircraft losses relative to their total numbers in theater, a statistic that Soviet Air Force Command noted with the same clinical precision Batz had applied to his own losses, though for entirely opposite reasons. Pokryshkin himself would finish the war credited with dozens of confirmed aerial victories, the overwhelming majority scored in the cockpit of the aircraft he had inherited with skepticism and turned into the instrument of his own reputation, eventually becoming one of only 3 Soviet pilots awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times over. But the number that mattered most to the men who had flown beneath his command was smaller and far less decorated. The count of pilots from his own squadron who survived the Kuban campaign to fly again, men whose names appear not in award citations, but in the simple fact of their continued existence, in letters written home from airfields further west as the front moved on without them. Grigory Rechkalov, the young lieutenant who had learned patience from a cannon that rewarded waiting, survived the Kuban campaign and continued flying alongside Pokryshkin for the remainder of the war, eventually finishing among the highest-scoring Soviet aces of the entire conflict, a record built substantially in the cockpit of the same aircraft that had arrived in his squadron with a reputation nobody trusted. He did return, eventually, to the village outside Sverdlovsk, carrying the proof he had promised his father. Not a medal alone, but the simple, undeniable fact that he had come home when so many around him had not, flying a machine that had asked to be trusted and had, in the hands of men willing to learn its particular grammar of flight, answered that trust with the lives it helped preserve. The aircraft that America built and gave away, that Britain flew briefly and discarded, had found in the skies over a river delta in southern Russia the one set of circumstances under which its strange, rejected design became not merely adequate but decisive, and it had done so not because the machine itself changed, but because the men who flew it learned, patiently and at great cost, exactly where its flaws stopped maturing and its strengths began. Chapter 10. What Remains in Krasnodar. The Kuban campaign ended in the autumn of 1943 with the German bridgehead abandoned, the road to the Caucasus oil fields sealed permanently against the advance that had once threatened to reach it, and the skies above that river delta remembered, on both sides of the conflict, as among the fiercest sustained air fighting of the entire war. Wilhelm Batz survived the campaign, survived the war entirely, and in post-war interviews conducted decades later, reflecting on his service across the Eastern Front, he identified the Kuban as the single hardest period of fighting in his entire combat career. Harder, in his own words, than any battle he fought in the skies over Western Europe in the war's final desperate months. The pilot who had once dismissed an aircraft with a single contemptuous word closed his own war narrative by identifying that same aircraft's campaign as the one that had taught him, more than any other, the true cost of underestimating an opponent. The airfield near Krasnodar from which Pokryshkin's squadron flew is farmland today. Wheat and sunflower fields stretching across ground that once carried the weight of American-built fighters on Soviet gear, patched by lamplight and flown by men who had learned to trust a machine two nations had already given up on. But in the Great Patriotic War Museum in Krasnodar, behind reinforced glass, sits a recovered section of an Airacobra's nose cone, pulled decades after the war from a marsh where the aircraft had gone down during the Kuban fighting, its metal skin pitted with rust and impact scarring beyond easy reading. At its center, corroded but unmistakable in its outline, sits the hollow housing that once carried a 37mm cannon, the same black aperture that Wilhelm Batz first mistook on a cold April morning in 1943, for nothing more than an oddity on an aircraft he assumed he could ignore. What remains genuinely unresolved, decades after the Kuban campaign ended, is the precise fate of several Soviet Airacobra pilots whose aircraft were reported lost over the Delta's marshland during the heaviest fighting of May and June 1943. Men whose loss was recorded in unit logs, but whose wreckage, in a landscape of shifting wetland and post-war Soviet secrecy around Lend-Lease equipment losses, was never definitively located or matched to individual crew. Russian aviation archaeology groups continue, even now, to search that same marshland for aircraft that official records acknowledge went down but cannot confirm were ever recovered. A quiet, unresolved accounting that the passage of more than 80 years has not closed. The fighter America rejected flew its most important campaign not for the nation that built it, but for the nation willing to trust a flawed machine into the hands of a commander patient enough to learn its grammar of flight. The engine still sits in memory, if nowhere else, behind where a pilot's spine once pressed against a cold aluminum seat back over the Kuban, and the cannon it drove through that narrow crankshaft still holds, in a glass case in southern Russia, the outline of the weapon that turned contempt into caution and caution, eventually, into legend.